At 10:03 a.m. on June 19, 1944, the air over the Pacific didn't smell like salt anymore. It smelled like high-octane aviation fuel and unadulterated panic. This was the scent of history's hinge point, a metallic tang carried on a wind that had swept across thousands of miles of open ocean to gather here in the Philippine Sea for a single, catastrophic collision. On the flight deck of the USS Lexington, a floating city of steel and purpose, the noise was a physical entity. It was the thunder of idling Pratt & Whitney radial engines, the shriek of superchargers, the metallic clatter of arrestor hooks, and beneath it all, the frantic coded shouts of men whose voices were raw from screaming over the din. And in the helmet of every pilot strapped into a cockpit, a new layer of bedlam, the radio screaming with reports that didn't make sense. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu sat in the shuddering center of this maelstrom, a singular point of focused calm in a universe of chaos. His world was the cockpit of his Grumman F6 F3 Hellcat, a machine known as the Ironworks for its rugged bulldog strength. But his particular Ironworks was sick. It wasn't just rough, it was angry. The massive engine up front, a 2,000 horsepower beast, was throwing a mechanical tantrum, spitting thick black oil across his windshield in rhythmic gouts. Before he'd even released the brakes, his view of the frantically waving deck officer was smeared into a greasy rainbow-colored haze. The deck officer wasn't just waving a launch signal. He was pointing, stabbing a gloved finger repeatedly at the sky to the west. A sky that was, according to the disembodied voices crackling in Vraciu's ears, about to fall. The radar operators in the Lexington's Combat Information Center, deep in the ship's bowels, weren't watching blips representing a squadron of enemy planes. They weren't tracking a wing. What painted their green phosphorescent screens was a solid, blooming wall of static, a meteorological impossibility, moving with terrifying purpose at over 300 miles an hour. It was the kind of return you'd expect from a thunderstorm, not an air armada. But this was no storm. This was the culmination of a desperate gamble. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, had just bet the entire remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese naval air power on a single colossal roll of the dice. He had emptied his aircraft carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, Zukaku, and others, like a man tipping out his last coins onto a gambling table. Every flyable machine with a propeller and a rising sun painted on its wings, the agile Zero fighters, the deadly Judy dive bombers, the lumbering Jill torpedo bombers, was now clawing for altitude, forming up into the largest coordinated aerial strike in the history of naval warfare. American intelligence, piecing together broken radio traffic and radar data, estimated the number at 450 aircraft. It was a number so large it felt abstract until you saw it painted as a solid mass on a radar scope, bearing down on you. And standing directly in the path of this avalanche of aluminum, explosives, and imperial ambition was Alex Vraciu, a 25-year-old from East Chicago, Indiana, sitting in a vibrating Hellcat that sounded to his trained ear like a tractor chewing on a bag of bolts. By every regulation in the United States Navy Handbook, his plane, Bureau number 40882, was grounded. It was a maintenance hazard, a flying coffin. The supercharger, the mechanical lung that allowed the engine to breathe in the thin air of high altitude, was rattling ominously in its housing. The magneto check showed a flickering needle. The engine was missing beats, running uneven. In any normal circumstance, on any other day, Vraciu would have cut the throttle, signaled the deck crew, and taxied back to the elevator for the mechanics to swarm over it. But there were no more normal circumstances. The calendar had run out. The handbook was irrelevant. The radar screen was full. The deck crew scrambled away, pulling the chocks from his wheels. The catapult officer dropped to one knee, his hand slashing downward. With a hiss of steam and a kick in the ass with the force of a freight train, the catapult flung Vraciu's Hellcat from 0 to flying speed in the space of the Lexington's 800-foot deck. The plane dipped sickeningly as it left the deck edge, its heavy load of fuel and ammunition fighting against gravity and the oily, humid air. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed the shuddering fighter would simply continue its downward arc and splash into the Pacific. Then the big four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller bit deep, found purchase, and the Hellcat, groaning in every rivet, clawed its way into the sky. Alexander Vraciu was airborne. He was alone, or near enough to it. His squadron, Fighting Squadron 16, had been scrambled in a frenzy, their formations scattered by the emergency launch. He was climbing into a fight that would decide the war in the Pacific, flying a broken plane, armed with a load of ammunition his fellow pilots called the suicide mix, and he had fought his own Navy for 24 hours just for the privilege. This is not just the story of a single dogfight, though one of history's most remarkable aerial engagements is at its heart. This is the story of a mind that refused to accept the standard solution. It is the story of a quiet rebellion against institutional wisdom, a war fought not just against zeros and Judies, but against paperwork, protocol, and peer pressure. It is the story of how the most lopsided aerial victory in history was forged not just by industrial might, but by the stubborn, grease-stained ingenuity of a man his comrades called the Janitor. Part 1. The Dirty War Below Decks. The conflict that would climax in the skies over the Pacific Sea began not with a roar of engines, but with the quiet, persistent sound of an argument in a humid steel room deep within the Lexington the night before.
June 18, 1944. The ship, part of the formidable American Task Force 58, was a world unto itself. In the officers' wardroom, pilots tried to project calm. Some played acey-deucey, the Navy's beloved backgammon variant, the dice clicks a feeble counter-rhythm to the ship's turbines. Others smoked lucky cigarettes, their nerves making the smoke tremble as it rose. A few wrote letters home, crafting sentences they prayed would never be read as last words. The atmosphere was a thick cocktail of adrenaline, fear, and the forced nonchalance of young men facing a statistically grim tomorrow. Alex Vraciu was not in the wardroom. He was 2 decks down in the fluorescent-lit, oily confines of the ship's aviation ordnance workshop. The air here was different. It smelled of cordite, gun oil, hot metal, and sweat. This was the realm of enlisted men, the armorers, the metalsmiths, the technicians whose hands actually built, loaded, and maintained the tools of death. Officers, by the unspoken rules of the Navy's caste system, did not belong here. They flew the planes. Enlisted men fixed them, armed them, fueled them. That was the natural order. Alexander Vraciu broke that order every single day. To the other pilots of VF-16, Vraciu was a bit of a weirdo. They called him the Janitor behind his back, not because he cleaned floors, but because he was obsessively, compulsively involved in the dirty, greasy, technical details that officers were supposed to ignore. While they studied tactics and navigation, Vraciu studied mechanics and ballistics. He could disassemble and reassemble a Browning .50 caliber machine gun blindfolded. He understood the arcane physics of supercharger gears and the chemical properties of incendiary compounds. He didn't just want to know how to shoot, he wanted to know what he was shooting and why it worked or didn't. This night, he was standing over a waist-high pile of linked 50-caliber ammunition belts, his hands already black with gun oil, locked in a low-voiced, intense argument with Master Chief Petty Officer Roland or Raleigh Stiles. Stiles was a bull of a man, with forearms like cured hams and a face that had seen every kind of pilot-induced idiocy in 2 decades of service. He had been loading aircraft guns since Vraciu was in short pants, and he regarded the young lieutenant with a mixture of professional respect and profound exasperation. The argument, as it almost always was with Vraciu, was about the bullets. The standard-issue ammunition loadout for a U.S. Navy F-6F Hellcat was a masterpiece of bureaucratic compromise, a recipe born of committee thinking and mass production necessity. It was known as the Universal or General Purpose Belt. For every 4 rounds, the sequence was precise: 1 armor-piercing, AP, 1 armor-piercing incendiary, API, 1 high-explosive incendiary, and 1 tracer. It was designed to do a little bit of everything: punch through light armor, start fires, explode with fragmentation, and provide a glowing path for the pilot to correct his aim. The Navy loved it. It was safe, standardized, and easy to manufacture by the tens of millions. It was the textbook solution. Vraciu looked at a standard belt like a chef looking at a TV dinner. He found it bland, inefficient, and worse, dangerously misleading. "I don't want the tracers, Chief," Vraciu said, for what felt to Stiles like the 100th time. Stiles sighed, the sound like steam escaping a boiler. He rubbed his temples. "Lieutenant, the tracers are there so you can see. It's like driving a car at night with your headlights off. You're flying blind." "That's the point," Vraciu insisted, his voice calm but intense. "The tracers lie to you, Chief. They've got a different weight and burn rate than the combat rounds. At anything over 300 yards, their trajectory starts to diverge. You see the glow hitting, but your real bullets are going somewhere else. You waste ammo correcting for a lie." He leaned forward, tapping a finger on the linked belt. "And worse, they're a one-way telegram to every Jap gunner in the sky. Here I am. Here's exactly where my guns are pointed. Please shoot back." They turn you from a hunter into a neon target. Stiles shook his head. It was the arrogance of the ace. Vraciu already had 12 kills to his name that galled him. This kid thought he knew better than the entire Bureau of Ordnance. But Vraciu's real heresy wasn't what he wanted to take out. It was what he wanted to put in. He reached past the chief and picked up a single cartridge from a separate crate. It was distinct. Where the standard rounds had copper or steel jackets, this one had a sleek silver-colored tip. It was the M8 armor-piercing incendiary, a nasty piece of work. "This is what I want," Vraciu said, holding it up. "The M8, 100%, a hot belt. No AP, no HE, and for God's sake, no tracers, just this." Stiles' face went from exasperated to grim. "Lieutenant, you are asking me to build you a bomb with wings. That round is unstable. It's got a compressed incendiary fill in the tip, magnesium or something like it. It ignites on impact at about 3,000 degrees. You put a belt of nothing but those in a closed gun bay and you fire a sustained burst." "The barrels heat up," Vraciu finished for him, nodding. "I know. The chemicals in the rounds could cook off. I could blow my own wings off." "So you do understand the physics lesson," Stiles crossing his arms. "The Browning 50 caliber wasn't designed for sustained fire with a full hot belt. It's a recommendation, not a rule, for a reason. It's a damn good way to get dead." But Vraciu wasn't listening to the warning. He was operating from a different set of data, drawn not from manuals written in Washington, but from the burning wrecks he'd seen spinning into the South Pacific. "Chief," he said, his voice dropping, "what do we know about the Zero, the A6M?" Stiles shrugged. "Fast, agile, turns on the dime." "And why?" Vraciu pressed. "Because it's light.
The Jap engineers stripped out everything to make it light. That means no pilot armor, no armor plate behind the engine, and most importantly, he paused for emphasis, no self-sealing fuel tanks. He held up the silver-tipped M8 again. Our Hellcat is a flying tank. You can put holes in it, and the rubber lining in the fuel cells seals around the bullet. A Zero is a flying Zippo lighter. One good spark in that fuel tank, and the whole thing goes up. If I hit him with a standard AP round, I punch a neat hole. The fuel might leak, he might lose pressure, he might even fly home. But if I hit him with this... He let the implication hang in the oily air. He doesn't leak, he burns. One round in the right place could do the job of 20. He was preaching to a skeptical congregation. The other pilots who drifted through or heard about Vraciu's obsession mocked him openly. "Just point the nose and pull the trigger, Alex," they'd laugh in the mess. "Stop trying to be a scientist. Let the armorers do their job." They called his proposed loadout the suicide mix. They said he'd jam his guns on the first pass, overheat his barrels, and spend the rest of the engagement as a defenseless, glowing target. Vraciu absorbed the ridicule like his Hellcat absorbed flak. It dented the surface, but didn't penetrate the core. He wasn't trying to be a maverick for the sake of it. He was an engineer in a pilot's uniform, and he saw a problem with an inefficient solution. His goal was optimal destruction. The argument with Master Chief Styles stretched into the small hours. It was not a shouting match, but a grinding war of attrition, fought with data points, anecdotal evidence, and Vraciu's implacable quiet will. He didn't pull rank overtly, he simply refused to yield. Finally, around 0200, with the pre-dawn Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, soon to be launched, Styles' resistance broke. It was less a conversion and more a surrender to exhaustion and the relentless pressure of the coming battle. The fleet was on high alert. Everyone would need their planes armed and ready. He couldn't afford to have a stubborn lieutenant occupying his workspace all night. "Fine," Styles barked, throwing his hands up in defeat. "You want to fly a bomb, Lieutenant? We'll build you a bomb. But when those wings turn into Roman candles, don't come crying to me, and you're signing for this, in writing." Vraciu nodded, a faint, tired smile on his face. "Thank you, Chief." The order went out to the ordnance crews. 6 Browning M2.5 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, each gun fed by a 400-round belt, 2,400 rounds in total, and almost every single one of them was to be the silver-tipped M8 armor-piercing incendiary. No tracers to give away his position, no standard mix for safety, just a river of invisible fire, coiled in the wings of his Hellcat like sleeping, volatile snakes. The Janitor had won his first battle. The war for the sky would begin at dawn. Part 2. Into the Swarm. Back on the vibrating flight deck at 10:03 a.m., the memory of that argument was a distant dream, washed away by the immediate, overwhelming reality of noise, vibration, and accelerating G-force. As Vraciu's Hellcat was slung into the sky, his world narrowed to a set of immediate critical tasks: keep the plane flying, gain altitude, find the enemy. He climbed hard, the oil smear on his windshield worsening, forcing him to hunch forward and peer through a small, clean patch he'd wiped on the side panel. Altitude was life insurance. You could spend it to gain speed in a dive, but you couldn't buy it back when you were low, slow, and vulnerable. The radio was a chaotic stream. The fighter direction officer in the Lexington CIC, the voice of God, tried to vector the scattered defenders. The voices of other pilots crackled with terse updates and clipped warnings. The scale of the incoming raid was becoming horrifyingly clear. At 15,000 feet, Vraciu broke through a thin layer of cumulus. He checked his gun switches, he charged the 6 Brownings. He could almost feel the heavy belts of M8s, an aberrant load waiting in their chambers. His engine continued its discordant symphony, the missed beat in the magneto check, now a constant worrying throb in the airframe. Then the FDO's voice, strained but controlled. All Wildcats, Vector 270, Angels 20, many bogeys, repeat, many bogeys, very, very many. Vraciu banked onto the heading. The vibrations seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. He was alone. The promised formations of Hellcats were scattered dots in the vastness of the sea. And then he saw them. At first, they were a smudge on the western horizon, a dark thickening in the haze. Then, as he closed the distance, the smudge resolved into a swarm, a migration. It wasn't a neat textbook formation. It was a vast, tiered cloud of aircraft, layered from just above the wave tops to nearly 20,000 feet. At the bottom, skimming the sea, were the torpedo bombers, Jills, their heavy fish-like ordnance slung beneath them. In the middle, the main body, were the Judy dive bombers, Aichi D-3As, the primary ship killers, and buzzing around the top like furious protective hornets were the Zero fighters. The sheer mass of it was paralyzing. 50 aircraft in this one cluster alone. The math was absurd, tragic, and almost funny. One broken American Hellcat versus a flying naval task force. A sane pilot would have assessed the situation, reported the contact, and looked for friendlies to regroup. A sane pilot would have seen the sputtering engine, the impossible odds, and decided that surviving to defend the fleet from a more manageable position was the better part of valor. Alexander Vraciu, the janitor, was not looking for valor. He was looking for efficiency. He looked at that immense, somewhat sloppy formation, the Judys drifting, the Zeros weaving impatiently, and didn't see an insurmountable threat. He saw a target-rich environment. He saw a buffet of unsealed fuel tanks and unarmored cockpits, all flying straight and level toward his home and friends as if on a Sunday outing. They felt safe in their numbers. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Vraciu pulled the stick back and continued to climb, angling to the east. He needed the sun. In the visual calculus of aerial combat, the sun was the ultimate weapon, the only camouflage that never failed. If you positioned yourself between your enemy and the sun, you disappeared. The blinding glare hid your silhouette, masked your approach, and confused gunners. He clawed his way up to 24,000 feet, the straining supercharger howling in his ears, until he was a tiny, unseen speck perched high above the Japanese armada. He felt like a hawk on a thermal, looking down at a field of mice. He took a moment to scan, to pick his first target. Not the agile Zeros at the top, not yet. He would go for the heart of the strike, the bombers. He selected a Judy dive bomber drifting slightly off the left flank of the formation. The pilot was likely a replacement, a teenager struggling to hold station in the turbulence. Perfect. Vraciu pushed the Hellcat's nose down. The heavy fighter, all weight and intent, dropped like a stone. The airspeed indicator wound up. 300 knots, 350, 400. The violent engine-induced vibration smoothed out, replaced by the clean, high-pitched scream of wind tearing over the wings. This was the moment of truth, not for Vraciu's courage, but for his theory, for his suicide mix. The armorer had warned him. The experts had laughed. The M8 rounds were lighter. They might tumble. They might not penetrate at long range. They might simply spark harmlessly against an enemy's skin. If they were right, Vraciu was about to bounce a few pretty fireworks off a Judy's wing and then find himself in the crosshairs of 50 angry tail gunners. He closed the distance with terrifying speed. 2,000 yards, 1,000 yards. He didn't fire. Rookies panicked and sprayed from half a mile, hitting nothing but sky and wasting ammunition. Vraciu's discipline was iron. He had to be sure. He needed to be close enough to see the rivets, to aim for the specific, vulnerable points his study had identified. At 600 yards, the Judy filled his reflector sight. He could see the dark blob of the pilot's head in the cockpit. He squeezed the trigger. Not a long, hysterical burst, a short, controlled, surgical tap. Less than a second, maybe 40 rounds. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. A standard .50 caliber hit would produce a puff of debris, maybe a trail of smoke or vapor as fluids leaked. What happened to the Judy was of a different order entirely. Vraciu's stream of M8 API rounds struck the bomber's wing root precisely at the junction of wing and fuselage where the main fuel tanks were located. The silver-tipped rounds didn't just penetrate the thin aluminum skin. On impact, their incendiary filler ignited with violent immediacy. There was no smoke trail, no gradual fire. One moment, the Judy was an airplane. The next, it was a blossoming, sun-bright sphere of orange and yellow flame. The explosion was so violent, the aircraft seemed to dissolve within the fireball. Pieces, none larger than a door, tumbled out of the inferno, trailing smoke as they spun toward the ocean miles below. The flash was so intense, Vraciu saw its reflection flicker across his own instrument panel. In the cockpit, there was no time for triumph, only confirmation. It worked. The theory was sound. The M8 wasn't just a bullet, it was a catalyst for instantaneous conflagration. The Zero wasn't a Zippo, it was a matchbook, and the Judy was a flying fuel drum. The experts were wrong. The janitor's load was not suicide, it was sorcery. Vraciu didn't pause. Speed was life. He used the tremendous kinetic energy from his dive to pull back on the stick, zooming back up in a climbing turn, trading speed for altitude, shooting back up into the concealing glare of the sun before the Japanese formation could comprehend what had happened. He glanced back. The formation was rippling with confusion. Pilots were craning their necks, looking for a squadron of attackers, for a coordinated bounce. They saw a fireball and wreckage, but no shooter. The concept that a single, unseen aircraft could have done this was, at that moment, unthinkable to them. Vraciu rolled over and dove again.
Kill 5. This Judy's pilot saw him coming and banked hard, a good defensive move. Vraciu compensated, leading the target, firing a slightly longer burst. The incendiary chain sawed-walked across the fuselage and into the engine. Another violent eruption. This one was so close that Vraciu flew through the expanding fireball. For a second, his world was orange, silent but for the spang and clatter of debris against his wings. He emerged on the other side, windshield sooted, wings dented, but flying. Kill 6. The last of this string was a Judy trailing the pack, its pilot pushing black smoke from its engine to catch up. Vraciu cut him off, closing to point-blank range, 50 yards. So close he could see the frantic rear gunner trying to clear a jam. There was no pity, only calculus. A short burst. The M8 sawed the bomber's tail clean off. The aircraft snapped in two mid-air, the pieces cartwheeling apart. 6 kills, in approximately 8 minutes of combat. He checked his ammo counters. He had fired roughly 360 rounds, 60 bullets per kill. Naval aviator doctrine suggested it took hundreds, even thousands of rounds to destroy a sturdy bomber. Vraciu had just proved that with the right bullet, in the right place, it took a magazine's worth. The suicide mix had been, in fact, the ultimate efficiency. Part 4. The Turkey Shoot and the Silence. Vraciu's personal war was just one tiny, furious data point in a vast battle history would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. All across the sky that day, U.S. Navy pilots flying Hellcats, supported by superb radar direction and combat information centers, savaged the Japanese formations. The combination of advanced technology, better trained pilots, and superior aircraft produced a staggering lopsided victory. Over the course of the day, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire would shoot down over 400 Japanese aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm was effectively annihilated in a single afternoon, a loss from which it would never recover. For Vraciu, the battle ended with a new danger, friendly fire. In his pursuit, he had flown into the defensive perimeter of Task Force 58. The sky around him blossomed with black puffs of 5-inch anti-aircraft fire. To the nervous gunners on the ships below, his Hellcat was just another speck to be swatted. A near miss rocked his plane violently. He dove for the deck, skimming the waves, flashing his American silhouettes toward the fleet, and turned for home. His engine was now gasping, coughing on fumes. His landing gear lowered with a worrying clunk. He lined up with the Lexington's deck, a postage stamp on a heaving blue plane. He caught the third wire with a jolt that slammed him against his harness. He was down, alive. As he slid back the canopy, the sounds of the battle were replaced by the deck crew's shouts and the ship's own noises. He stood up in the cockpit, his body trembling with spent adrenaline. The crew swarmed around his plane, then stopped, staring. His Hellcat was a mess. It was dented, scorched, smeared with oil and soot. It looked like it had flown through hell, because it had. Then Vraciu saw Master Chief Stiles. The armorer was staring not at Vraciu, but at the gun ports on the wings. He expected to see blistered, warped metal, signs of catastrophic overheating. He saw only blackened smudges. Vraciu, taking off his helmet, didn't say a word. He simply looked at the chief, cracked a tired, oil-streaked grin, and held up 6 fingers. A photographer's mate capturing the scene of a returning pilot caught the moment. The exhausted young face, the greasy flight suit, the fierce triumphant grin, and the 6 fingers held high against the Pacific sky. The image would become one of the most iconic of the Pacific War, a symbol of defiant victory. But the real proof was in the gun bays. Stiles, still skeptical, ordered the panels opened. The ammunition belts were drawn out. They were still heavy. The math was done, and it was incontrovertible. Vraciu had used less than 1/3 of his ammunition to destroy 6 enemy aircraft. "How?" asked Stiles, his voice hushed, all former skepticism gone. Vraciu, lighting a cigarette with still shaking hands, simply said, "I told you, Chief, I didn't need to shred them, I just needed to light them." The ridicule stopped. The suicide mix was rechristened the Vraciu belt. Piloters suddenly wanted to know the exact recipe. The quiet janitor, who had been mocked for his obsession with greasy details, had rewritten the tactical manual in the span of 8 minutes. He had proven that in the high-stakes physics of aerial combat, precision and chemistry could trump volume and tradition. Epilogue: The Quiet Man. Wars end. The adrenaline fades. The roaring silence that follows is often the hardest thing for warriors to bear. Alexander Vraciu finished the war as the U.S. Navy's 4th-ranking ace, with 19 confirmed aerial victories, 12 before the Turkey Shoot. He was a hero, decorated with the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and multiple air medals. He could have ridden that fame for a lifetime: book deals, speaking tours, a military career ascension. That wasn't his style. Vraciu was at his core a problem solver, a craftsman. The war was the ultimate engineering problem. It was solved. He left the Navy, moved to California, and became a banker. For the next 30 years, Alexander Vraciu, the man who once dove single-handed into an armada, sat behind a polished desk in a quiet office, approving mortgage loans and calculating interest rates. His customers saw a polite, balding, gentle man with a calm smile. They had no inkling that the hands, now endorsing their paperwork, had once, with surgical precision, sent 6 aircraft and their crews to a fiery end in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. He almost never spoke of the war. He deflected praise to his mechanics, his shipmates, his squadron. "I was just doing my job," he'd say. "The real work was done by the men who kept the planes flying." He refused the mantle of legend, choosing instead the cloak of normalcy. But legends have lives of their own. In naval aviation schools, instructors still teach the Vraciu curve, the disciplined, energy-conserving approach that emphasizes closing to near point-blank range before firing. They teach the importance of knowing your weapon system intimately, down to the chemistry of the bullets.
They hold up the story of June 19th, 1944 as a testament to the fact that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is question the standard issue. That innovation doesn't always come from a laboratory. It can come from a grimy ordnance workshop, from a mind unwilling to accept good enough. Alexander Vraciu died peacefully in his sleep in 2015 at the age of 96. The vibrations of a troubled Pratt & Whitney engine, the smell of cordite and burning magnesium, the gut clench of a high G dive, all were decades in the past. But that photograph remains. It freezes a moment where a janitor, a mechanic in a pilot's suit, looked at the gathered might of an empire, looked at his own rule-breaking tools, and grinned. It is not the grin of a banker. It is the fierce, focused grin of a craftsman who has just seen his theory proven spectacularly, devastatingly correct. We tell these stories not to glorify war's destruction, but to rescue from silence the stories of consequential ingenuity. History memorializes the generals who move flags on maps. It often forgets the lieutenants who move pins on drafting tables, who argue with master chiefs over bullet types, who understand that victory sometimes hinges not on following the plan, but on perfecting the tool. Alexander Vraciu was told his idea was stupid, his method suicidal. He was told to be a team player, to fly and fight like everyone else. He didn't listen. He loaded his guns with silver-tipped fire, climbed into the sun, and wrote his rebuttal across the sky in smoke and flame. He proved in 8 indelible minutes that the difference between madness and genius is often just a matter of perspective and whether or not you hit your target.